Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today. Today we have an educational seminar coming to you about what is grief. It's part one of a series we're going to do together, and it's the Dorothy Ley Hospice, House Hospice, and the Regional Learning Center coming together in response to a need we were seeing when the pandemic struck, and just how much more everybody was talking about grief and wanting to know and learn more about it. So my name is Megan. I'm the bereavement care coordinator at Dorothy Ley Hospice, and my lovely colleague Peggy from House Hospice is with us today as well. So we're going to work together here to bring you this educational presentation. And we're coming from a really basic foundational lens of what is grief. It's a concept that is not always really very well understood out in our wider contemporary society. And it's a big, big topic. So we're going to be coming at it from a very basic understanding, a really introductory lens for today. And we're excited to have you all here with us and glad that you're so willing to learn. So we're going to get right into the presentation. So to start with our very first presenting question, what is grief? Grief is a natural human response to a loss of any kind. You're going to hear me say that a lot. Those words, natural, human, normal, I'm going to say quite a bit. You'll hear that over and over. And that's to really drive the point home. It is so natural and so normal that if you open yourself up to the presence of love in your life, and that love becomes lost to you, you will so very naturally come to grief. It is the most human thing in the world to do. Now, that said, the way that I encounter grief in my work and the way that Peggy sees it in hers is very, very often in response to somebody who has lost somebody due to a death. But grief doesn't just respond to loss due to death. As it says in the description there, it is a natural human response to loss of any kind. So if a relationship becomes lost to you, not because of death, but because of divorce or breakup or estrangement or separation, there will be grief that is the response to that loss. If you are moving countries and you're leaving your home country behind and immigrating, then you will come to grief having lost that sense of home and country and culture. Any loss of any kind, if you were to lose a job, if you were to have a health care scare or a life-limiting diagnosis, these are losses, non-death losses that also promote or prompt a grief response. And this is all normal. This is all human. It is so incredibly natural that if something is to become lost to you, you will find yourself experiencing grief. We are social creatures. When we are very, very small, the very first thing that we do is we attach to our caregivers. We attach to our parents, our guardians. Then we further go on to attach to siblings or friends, romantic partners. We create attachments through our lives, and we can attach to parts of our identity, perhaps, that are informed by our jobs or other things that give our life meaning. So when those attachments become severed, once again, the most natural, normal human thing in the world is to experience grief as a result. So loss, grief, is highly individual. It is as individual as you are, because our grief is informed by all of our collective experiences as a person. It's built up of everything that has come before us, everything that we know of ourselves, and is contextualized by the relationship that is unique to us that has become lost. So no two people will go through grief the exact same way. The way that I experience grief is going to be very different from the way that Peggy experiences grief, from the way that you experience grief, and so on. It is a highly individual experience. So we can never paint everybody with the same brush, knowing that it's so unique to each individual that encounters it. And grief is painful. It can hurt a lot. Doesn't have to, depending on the circumstances of your grief. Potentially there can be a lot of peace and love that surrounds the experience. And we would wish that for you. But in most cases, in a lot of cases, grief is very, very painful. It hurts us. Our hearts might feel like they're broken. So because it hurts so much, because it's so prickly and raw and painful, it's very, very hard to understand grief as a friend. We might not be able to think of it that way. When we say that we want to embrace our grief or move toward our grief, that can be a really hard thing to understand because it doesn't feel very good. The pain that comes from grief can feel really, really terrible. So we can't necessarily look at it as a friend. It doesn't feel that way. It's a little too prickly for that. But it's not an enemy either. Our grief has a real function in our ability to move forward in our lives and to eventually heal our broken hearts. So grief is maybe not a friend. It's not an enemy, but perhaps we can see it as an ally in our healing, in our ability to put the pieces of our broken heart back together. It's a teacher. Grief tells us all about what's important in our lives, the way we want to live our lives now, how we want to be in the world, and the characteristics and traits that we want to bring in to the world that are important to us now. It teaches us what's important. It allows us to heal, and so it is an ally, even if we can't feel it as a friend. And it has a function. Going through grief will ultimately allow us to heal. If given its time, its space, its credence. There's a few things that grief is not. Grief is not feeling sorry for yourself. Grief is not sitting in a wallowing pit of self-pity and living in the past and refusing to let go of something in the past. These might be messages that grievers get sent a lot of the time, that you need to stop feeling sorry for yourself. You need to let go and move on. You need to stop living in the past. Grief is none of these things. You are grieving. Your heart is hurt. And so you are not indulging yourself in a pool of self-pity. You are feeling the very real grief and heartache and pain that comes from losing somebody or losing something. Grief is not a weakness. It is not something we need to pathologize or medicalize. It is not a disorder of any kind. Again, it is the most natural, normal, human thing in the world. And you are doing nothing wrong by grieving. You're not refusing to let go. You're listening to the internal wisdom that your heart has to tell you that I need time. I need to feel this. So hopefully we can empower you with this message that grief is none of these things. Grief is your pain in action. Grief is allowing you to heal ultimately with time and space and the work of grief. Now, grief impacts us on all levels of our being, all ways in which we know to be in the world. Grief will have an impact on us. So we often think of grief and we think, oh, I'll be sad and I'll cry. And others will think that for us. If we come to grief, they'll think, oh, for a time they'll be sad and they'll cry and then they'll get back up and move on and buck up. But the reality is that grief is a holistic experience and will turn up in every realm of our being. So certainly it is emotional. Absolutely it's emotional. And certainly sadness is a huge part of it. Deep sorrow can be a huge part of it, but that's not the full breadth of the emotional experience. There can be anger, very real anger. There can be disappointment and confusion, and there can be joy and peace and love. And there can be surprise and disgust and fear. Oh, fear is huge in grief. So any feeling word that you can attach to the human experience, you can understand to be there in grief. And you can bounce around between all of these emotions in the course of a day, in the course of an hour, in the course of a minute. So it is far more than just feeling sad and crying a little bit. It is the full breadth of our emotional experience, all tied up potentially at one time even, which makes it very overwhelming and can feel like we're going a little bit crazy, but you're not. You're grieving, and it is a very emotional experience. It's also physical, which we don't totally understand or hold up in our society. We don't recognize that these ailments that I'm feeling could be my grief that's coming to me. I'm exhausted all the time. I wake up so tired, and I've just slept for 8 hours straight, because grief is exhausting. It takes everything out of us. We can feel it in aches and pains in our body that we don't totally know why they're coming through, or if we have headaches because we're just so exhausted all the time, and because the emotional toll that this is taking finds its way out in other ways as well. So I can feel these headaches, I can feel nauseous, I can have a startle response that all of a sudden is very, very exaggerated. Physically, our bodies feel our grief. I remember thinking, my body is as broken as my heart is. Absolutely, there is a physical toll that gets taken on us when we're grieving. Cognitively as well, big time. There's a huge cognitive impairment when we are having a grief experience, when we're mourning the loved one that we lost, that we miss. You know, you can walk into a room and think, why did I walk in here? I know there was a reason. Or you go to the grocery store and you can't for the life of you remember what you're doing there. Why did I need to come here today? What was it that I was after? Our ability to focus becomes very, very impaired. Our ability to concentrate, all of a sudden we can read the same paragraph of book 10 times over and take in no meaning. Or we get to work where we're used to being really, really efficient in what we do, and I know this and I can do this, and then all of a sudden, why can't I do this? Why does work seem so hard? Why am I so discombobulated? And why can't I remember the things I need to do? Because our memory takes a hit as well. Our short-term memory, severely impaired. So hard to remember, to focus, to concentrate in grief. And our social being is impacted hugely as well. If you have other folks in your life who have gone through grief of their own, or you find other people in the aftermath of your grief who are also grieving, you'll find that you speak the same language. Grieving hearts recognize other grieving hearts. And that can be a wonderful healing mechanism when we find those people. And unfortunately, there might be folks in your life who all of a sudden you don't speak the same language as. Your language is different. They don't understand. They maybe don't know how to deal with you, and you don't know how to tell them to deal with you because you're emotional and you're physically impaired and you're cognitively impaired and you're going through grief and you don't know what you need. So you can't coach them on how to support you. And so your needs don't really line up. And there can be folks that are wonderful, that hold up your experience and that you really, really rely on to support you at this time. And then there can be folks that might disappoint you, that you expected to be there and who just can't for whatever reason. And so your social circle looks a little bit different. Maybe there's parts of your social circle that you don't feel you belong to anymore now that you've lost your loved one, or lost your job, or lost your healthy status. Spirituality is a huge part of grief very often. Your spiritual self can be impaired, can be impacted big time. Perhaps your faith is all you have to hold on to now, and you are gripping it for dear life. Or perhaps you are rejecting that completely. And I don't know how the higher power that I believe in could let this happen, and I cannot be with you right now. I cannot understand, and I need to be mad at you, and I just reject my faith at this time. Or perhaps we're not even looking at spirituality in terms of religion or faith. Maybe the death of somebody that you love has made you question the world in a way that you didn't before. Maybe you're asking the universe. Maybe you're asking your loved one, where are you? Are you somewhere? I need to believe that you're somewhere and that you're with me somehow. Whatever form it takes, your spiritual self may evolve. It may be something that you reject, but certainly it is something that is impacted by a grief experience. So we can see just how layered all of this is, just how all-encompassing our grief can be when you look at all the ways that it impacts our bodies. And no wonder we hurt so much. No wonder it is such a difficult thing to go through, because it impacts us every way that we have of being in the world. So you're not crazy, and you're not being dramatic. You are grieving, and that is hard, hard work. We are coming to you today in a time that is unprecedented. We have never seen anything like this in our society before. I am coming to you from my home, as is Peggy, because we are encountering this pandemic that has us distanced and far away from each other so as to stay safe. And this is part of what was talked about when we all came together to offer this seminar, is the grief that we are seeing in response to COVID-19. Not to say that everybody's having that response, but it is something that we're hearing a little bit more, that we're talking a little bit more. And that's why we have felt the need to bring this in for you. So this is what I'm calling the COVID compound, because if we're already grieving a loss, we've already suffered some sort of death or a loss in our lives, and now we also have to go through that during a pandemic, that compounds our experience. We're already going through something really difficult, and then we layer on top all of these things that are so making the experience so much harder right now. We're living in a time of tremendous social isolation. This is something that can happen in grief a lot. We talked about the social impact just a moment ago, and you might feel very alone in your grief. You might feel like nobody understands. And social isolation can definitely be a part of the experience, but now it is thrust upon us in this way that keeps us within our own homes. And we can't reach out to loved ones the way that we used to. We can't surround ourselves with the support that we would have normally had things been different. We can't spend time in our communities. We lack that time with the communities that are around us that we know can be so critical when we're grieving. We can't hug each other. There's very real touch deprivation that's happening out in the world right now. When we don't have words to express how we feel, we might offer somebody that we love, that we know is suffering, we might offer them a hug. Or we might seek that out for ourselves, just feeling so lonely and in need of human connection. And we're not able to do that right now. There's also an inability to be with loved ones at end of life. There's restrictions on who can be in different hospitals or healthcare settings. So if somebody that you love is dying, when you would normally be at their bedside, be with them, hold their hand, sing them songs, use that time together that remains, you might be unable to do that. And that is heart-wrenching. That is heartbreaking and heart-hurting, and will definitely have an impact on the way that we grieve. This inability to uphold our end-of-life rituals. If you weren't able to have a funeral or a memorial service for somebody that you love, or if you're putting it off till another time when everybody can be gathered, we might really feel that sense of being out to sea without knowing exactly where we are or where land is, because everything feels untethered and up in the air, unfinished. We lack our usual coping mechanisms right now. If you're somebody that needed to go out to the gym and physically expend your grief and interact with it that way, and you needed to get into one of your exercise classes and just sweat it out for an hour and punch the air and kick the air while in a community of people, and you can't do that now. We lack our usual coping mechanisms, and that has an impact on our grief, and that makes it harder as well. There's also a very real sadness that is larger than ourselves. We have our own grief, we have our own experience, but oh my gosh, do we hurt for others that are out there? The stories that we hear that are just so sad, that are so heartbreaking, the images that we've all seen in the media that just run right through us. There's a sadness that is bigger than just us. There is a sadness for our community. There's a sadness for the world right now that just feels so much larger than one individual person. And so we have this compounded effect because of the pandemic, and that might be what brought you here. That might really be why you are investigating grief in the first place. And if that's the case, then we're glad to have you with us looking at some of these things, because it's very real and it's very big. And the COVID compound will absolutely complicate the way that we grieve, or invite grief that might not have otherwise found its way in. So we're going to talk about a few myths that exist out in the world about grief. And this comes from author Alan Wolfelt, who is the director of the Center for Loss and Life Transition in Colorado. And these are some of the myths that he talks about that he likes to debunk. And so the first one is that there is a predictable and orderly progression to the experience of grief. I would love to tell you that that was true. Unfortunately, that is a myth, and we know that's not generally the experience of most grievers. The reality is that grief is not orderly and predictable. We would love to be able to tell you that you start like the picture on the side here that has the very natural progression down for a little while, but then back up and adjusted, and that's how your grief experience is going to go. In reality, we understand that grief looks much more like the other image, where we bounce around between all of these different places. This can be in the course of a week, a day, an hour, that we can bounce around between searching and yearning for our loved one, denial, numbness, shock, re-entry into the world, and then back to shock. And we can really, really understand that this is much more so the experience of folks who have gone through grief. Grief has no timetable either. I can't tell you that once you reach this point, once this happens, once X, Y, or Z takes place, that you'll be done. You'll wrap it up with a nice little bow, you'll put it on a shelf, and that'll be that. Grief has no timeline. Grief takes as long as it takes. And that's not to send you a hopeless message that you're always going to feel like this, it's always going to be terrible. Not at all. The message here is to empower you to take the time that you need, and to not fall victim to some of the other myths out there, like the fallacy of the first year. Just get through the first year and you'll be okay. And then we are made to feel shame and guilt when after the first year, we're not okay. We're still grieving. So it's meant to empower you to take the time that you need, because grief will take the time that it needs. Our second myth is that it is best to move away from grief instead of towards it. And because it's painful, like we talked about before, this is a very natural inclination. We as humans try to move away from pain. We don't want to encounter pain. We don't want to endure pain. So it is so natural and normal to want to move away from it. Unfortunately, this is also a myth. The reality is that we are healed from our suffering only by experiencing it to its fullest. We don't want to move away from our grief. We want to turn toward it. Listen to what it has to say, learn its lessons, give it its time and space, move through it, because the only way to the other side is through, and ultimately be healed by it. So we don't want to turn away. We don't want to pretend it's not there. We don't want to sweep it under the rug. We want to give it its voice and its time and do the work, so that ultimately we can put those pieces of our broken heart back together. The scars will always be there. You will be changed by this. The scars will remain on your heart, but it can be whole again. And we are healed from suffering only by experiencing it to its fullest, said Marcel Proust. Tears expressing grief are a sign of weakness. False. That is a myth. For some reason, we think that if you're not crying and if you're stoic and you've got that stiff upper lip, you're strong and you're doing great. And I'm here to tell you that there is so much value in expressing your grief through tears. This is another quote that I really love from Washington Irving, that there is a sacredness in tears. They are not a mark of weakness, but of power. They speak more eloquently than 10,000 tongues. They are the messengers of overwhelming grief, deep contrition, and unspeakable love. We cry in order to regulate ourselves emotionally. If we build everything up in our bodies and we don't allow it a release, we have the potential to really get ourselves kind of stuck. But if we allow ourselves that release, if we allow ourselves to cry, we wind up feeling better. It's a catharsis, it's a release. And there are studies to suggest that there is very real value in allowing ourselves to cry and the impact that it has on our bodies later for being more calm, for working our way through, for coming back down to a baseline of functioning, bring our arousal level down so that we can be calm and peaceful after and feel better. There's real value in allowing yourself to cry. The goal is to get over your grief. Another myth. We don't want to get over our grief. And this is something that grievers hear quite a bit. It's time to get over it. You need to get over it, get over it, get over it. And that is just not a very supportive or empathic or empowering message at all. So we're here to tell you that that is a myth as well. If that's what you're hearing, the reality is that you will likely grieve forever and you will not get over the loss of a loved one, but you do learn to live with it. You will heal and rebuild yourself around the loss you have suffered. You'll be whole again, but you will never be the same. So it's that idea, like I said before, this is coming from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and David Kessler. But when I was saying that we're putting the pieces of our broken heart back together by allowing ourselves a grief response, you'll never be the same. You will have those scars on your heart, but your heart can be put back together if you allow yourself the grace that is grieving. And again, this isn't to say it's always going to feel like this. This isn't a doomsday message that you're changed, you can't go back, and this is the way that it is now. But the reality is that you lost somebody important to you. That love doesn't just go away. Death ends a life, not a relationship. That relationship remains. So you will not get over your loss, but you'll learn to live with it. You will be able to reconcile it into your life story, into your being, to know that this happened to you. And it will inform the way that you live the rest of your life. You will build yourself around it. It will be a part of you. But you can build a life around that part of you that grieves. And the last myth that we want to talk about here is that grief and mourning are the same thing. And we talk about them like they are. And we use the words kind of interchangeably. And a lot of the times it doesn't necessarily matter that we do. But if you've come to grief, it is sometimes important to make this distinction. That grief and mourning are not the same thing. Your grief is everything that happens on the inside. Your internal experience of your grief. So the thoughts that sort of race and chase themselves around in your head, or the visions that come to you, sort of, maybe they're waiting on your pillow when you put your head down at night, or sort of like burned into the back of your eyelashes, those visions that you have, or the thoughts that chase themselves, all the feelings that you have inside your body that you don't express externally, everything that gets trapped in your body, those feelings, the physical sensations that we talked about before, everything on the inside is your grief, your internal experience. Mourning, by contrast, is when you take all of that stuff that's on the inside, all of that grief, and you put it outside of yourself. You externalize it. I like to think of it as giving your grief a voice if you're able to talk about it. if you're able to write about it, if you're able to sing or rap about it. It's an active process, mourning is. Taking everything that's on the inside and finding a way to put it outside of yourself is an active process of mourning. This can be something that you do by yourself. If you journal, or you write songs, or you write poetry, that is taking the grief that's on the inside and putting it outside of you. If you cry by yourself, that's taking the grief that's on the inside and putting it outside of you. And you can do that in an individual way, but mourning can also be done in a supportive company and community. If you have a support group that you go to, or just a regular group of friends or family that you're able to talk to about your experience. Your grief gone public is the way that Alan Wolfelt, the author of these myths, likes to put it sometimes. It's grief gone public. It's being able to say to the world, this is how much I hurt. And it doesn't really matter that these are different things, except when you understand that if you love somebody and you lose them, you will come to grief. But it will take effort, it will take action, it will take more to do the mourning. And the mourning is where the healing is. Mourning is what will put the pieces of your broken heart back together. Putting your grief into action, expressing it, putting it outside of yourself is what promotes healing, and is what will allow you to move through the experience, finding ways to mourn. And that's going to be very individual. Like we talked about in the very beginning, highly individual experience this grieving thing is. So your mourning will look very different. Maybe you're not somebody who can journal or write. Maybe you're somebody who needs to go out into the world and smash your feet against the pavement because you're so mad, and go for that really angry run. Whatever it looks like for you, turning your grief into mourning is what will help you to heal. So they're not the same thing. They are different. You might be here because you're in a role, either professionally or personally, that you're looking to support somebody else in their grief, because there is a lot of grief out there right now and we're seeing it. And we go, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? So how can you help others who are grieving? Well, there's ways to support and help facilitate their active mourning. If you're somebody that is able to do that, and we're not expecting everybody to be certified grief counselors. That's not necessarily within the scope of what you're doing, but within your role and within what's appropriate, if you're able to support and facilitate the active mourning for folks that you're trying to support, understanding that they're in grief, but that they might need help with opportunities to mourn. How might you facilitate that? Is there a picture in their home that you can point to and say, who's that? Tell me about them. Or how are you feeling today? And I really want to know. You don't have to say fine. Tell me how you're feeling. Tell me what you're thinking. It's important when we do this to realize that we can't take away the pain of grief. That is never the goal, is to take away the pain of grief. We know now that the pain plays a role, that it's functional, as terrible as it feels, and as much as we want to move away from it, and as much as it's okay to take breaks from that pain, you don't have to live in it. But it is there, and it is real, and we can't take it away. And to try to might sort of feel to the griever like we're really minimizing or trivializing their experience and what they're going through. If you say, oh, don't cry, they wouldn't want you to cry. Well, the message that the griever receives is, I can't cry with you. I can't talk to you. So they might censor themselves. They might not share how they're feeling if our goal is to take their pain away. But if we meet them where they are, sit down right beside them, listen without feeling the need to have answers or say the right thing. There's tremendous value in that, in the connection that exists when we're not trying to fix it or take away the pain, but just sitting beside somebody. We often, as supportive folks, will say nothing because we're so afraid of saying the wrong thing. And that will stop us in our tracks, and that will cause us to pretend that everything's okay and we're upbeat and we're not going to talk about this, and then it's easier to do it this way because we're so afraid of saying the wrong thing. So you feel free to release yourself from that need, that expectation that you have to say the right thing. You can just listen and be with somebody who might need you. You can do this by adopting the stance of learner. You're learning from somebody what their experience is all about. You're learning from somebody what they have to say about how they're feeling, how they're doing, what they're thinking, how they're feeling. You're not the teacher. You're not there to teach them about their experience. You're not their preacher to tell them how they should be doing things, or that they'd feel better if they just did this. You are a learner. And so when you listen without feeling the need to take somebody's pain away or have the right things to say, when you adopt the stance of learner, you're privileging your heart, the work of your heart, over the work of your head. And that's great. Because a lot of times logic doesn't help us in grief as much as our heart does. When we come from a place of our heart, the work of our heart, we can sit with the discomfort. We can engage with somebody in sacred silence. We can walk beside people in their grief. There's this lovely saying, do not follow me, I may not lead. Do not lead me, I may not follow. But walk beside me and be my friend. So when people say, what do I do? What do I do? Being is doing. Remember that. And from where everyone is coming from, the caregiving and the supportive roles that you assume in your life, I'm sure you're doing this. I feel very confident that you're doing this. And we always want to do more. What do I do? How do I do this? Being is doing. So do remember that. By being with somebody, learning from them and walking beside them, you are being with them, and being is doing. And how can you help yourself? Maybe you came here with the intention to learn how to support other people. Maybe you have your own grief experience. But regardless, how can you help yourself? Because even if you don't feel that you have a grief experience ongoing in your life right now and you're looking to support somebody else, you'll still need to find ways to support yourself through that, because it can be very difficult, heavy, heartfelt work to support other people in grief. So we always need to think about, how can I help myself through this? And I'm sure everybody's heard this so many times, and I'm going to say it again. It is so important to practice self-care. It is so important to know what that looks like for you, because again, that's another thing that's going to be very, very individual. What does self-care look like for you? What nourishes your soul? What fills your cup? And the word practice is very intentional, because we need to bring that into our lives in an ongoing way. We need to practice our self-care and not just engage when we are this close to burnout, because it's going to save us this time. And then stretch ourselves again and get this close to burnout, and then draw on our self-care resources. How do we practice it and build it into our daily lives? In that way, we're not only managing our stress, but we're allowing ourselves to find resilience against it. Stress management, if you have to go and have a bath at the end of a long day and really just relax in the tub and read a nice book, or kind of withdraw a little bit, close yourself up in your room and just not talk to anybody for a while as a result of a hard day or a hard week, that's stress management, and that's great stuff. But how do we build that in and practice that and create stress resilience for ourselves? How do we create a practice of these self-care strategies? How do we make them predictable and reliable in our daily lives so that we're, in an ongoing way, taking care of ourselves and working against the stress of our lives. And what does that look like for you? What nourishes your soul? What fills your cup? And cultivate the ability to check in with yourself. Really check in. Stop and sit and say, what do I need right now? We are always chasing the needs of others and trying to fill the needs of others, to sometimes the neglect of our own needs. What do I need right now? And stop and really ask. And is it beyond just 5 minutes peace? Do I need human connection? Do I need to nourish my body? What do I need right now? I always like to talk about ritual when we talk about grief. Ritual can be very comforting, can be very healing, can work our grief into our lives in a daily way, in a really beautiful, ceremonial way. Do we light a candle at the beginning or end of every day for our loved one? Do we say a little message or prayer to them at the beginning or end of every day? Or is there a part of your week where you intentionally visit your grief and your loved one? Try incorporating ritual. Make space for the grief. Turn it into mourning. And don't feel the need to have words necessarily. Ritual exists when words are difficult to find. And action can facilitate our grief and our mourning. Do know that you're doing good work. We know that you're doing good work. We know that you're out there being with people. Being is doing. And we know that you're coming here from a place of wanting to help, wanting to support, and giving of yourself and your heart. So know that you are doing good work. We don't always get it right every single time, and we are human and we will bungle it along the way. But you are doing an excellent job, and know that for yourself and remind yourself of that. As we go, respect our own boundaries and limitations. There has to be a place where you end and I begin. There has to be a time when I enter into my individual life away from my professional life and separate the two. There has to be a time to say no. You can't say yes to absolutely everything. Acknowledge and respect your own boundaries and limitations, and know that in doing so, you're actually helping yourself to be a better caregiver. Because if these boundaries and limitations are bleeding all over the place, everybody gets confused about what's appropriate and what's not. Nobody knows where they end and you begin. You're a better caregiver if you're able to hold up the boundaries that exist and support yourself and others in that way. And find ways to support your own grief and mourning. Again, maybe you're coming here looking for a way to support somebody else, but taking in their experience and being with them as they grieve and mourn, you may very well start to feel that you're having those same sorts of responses. Or maybe you are grieving actively right now. So how do we support your own grief and your own mourning? What can that look like? How can we do that? Where can we find the space and time for those things? And that's the end of what we have to say for today. Thank you very, very much for making it all the way through to the end here with us. We have a couple of questions that we'll like to address just before we close up. And one is, what would you say to somebody whose loved one is experiencing dementia or Alzheimer's? The experience of a loved one going through dementia or Alzheimer's is absolutely lined with grief. And we don't always necessarily see it as that. Dementia and Alzheimer's brings in a couple of different kinds of losses. So your loved one is still here, physically on this plane. They have not died, but they might not be the same person that you recognize. And we might be losing them little bit by little bit when they don't recognize you, or they start to lose some of the abilities that they had, or if we have to move them out of their home, or if there's crises, very real crises that can arise. So we get into the experience of what we call ambiguous loss, where your loved one is still here, but they're not the person that we knew. And so we grieve for that. And there's anticipatory loss in that as well. So grief doesn't just happen when the death happens. We don't necessarily lose somebody and then go into grief. If the experience of illness is far longer than that, if there's a diagnosis of not Alzheimer's and dementia, absolutely, maybe cancer, some other life-limiting illness, our grief can be responded to at that time. Our grief can find its way through at that time. We are anticipating losing someone that we love. And so that doesn't necessarily protect us when we do lose them. That doesn't mean that we won't grieve when they do die, but we start to grieve earlier. And as we watch the functionality change or the personality change or feel that we're losing them bit by bit, absolutely, grief lives there. And so it looks a lot like everything that we've talked about today. You have to find ways to support your own grief and mourning. And remember that that is valid, and that is okay, and that is a normal part of this. And we don't need to feel guilty for grieving somebody who's still here, because they're not here the way that we knew them. And it's having an impact on us. And we're feeling it emotionally, physically, cognitively, spiritually, and socially. So it's a really good question that is absolutely can be identified as a non-death loss at this time with our loved ones still around. And we will encounter ambiguous loss, we will encounter anticipatory grief, and there will be a very natural grief response to that. It looks like a lot of what we talked about today. And another question, what would we say to folks who encounter grief when they already have an experience of depression or anxiety or some other comorbid disorder? And that's another great question as well. And it's you're tapping into something really important there, and that is that your grief will absolutely not happen in a vacuum. Grief doesn't just happen by itself, it happens within the entire context of our lives. So when we say that this is so highly individual, that's part of what we're talking about. You know, your lived experience, your relationship with your loved one, but also the way that you are in the world right now, the other issues that you find yourself dealing with, the other parts of your life that are very, very much alive at the same time that your grief is. Absolutely, your grief is going to have an impact on all of these things. And absolutely, it's going to complicate things. Definitely. But what I would say is that we do have to remember that our grief, again, I'm going to say it again, it is a natural, normal process. It is the most human thing in the world. So we want to make sure not to vilify our grief, not to pathologize our grief, but to recognize it as a normal process that will take time, that will take work, that will need its voice, and not to shame ourselves for feeling all of these things, because we need to. We need to move through our grief. We need to work through our grief. And that's fine, and that's okay, and that's valid, and that doesn't in any way negate the other things that you're going through. They'll all touch on each other, and they'll all bump up against each other, and they'll all interact. But what we need to remember is just how natural and normal grief is, and empowering ourselves to go through that process and know that that's okay and that we need to. And I'm just going to see if there's anything that I've missed or lost or forgotten. Peggy, is there anything you'd like to say toward the end of our presentation today?
No, Megan, I think you've done a wonderful job of presenting the reality of grief, and you know, that each person's grief is so unique on this planet. Each griever is the expert of their own grief experience, and you know, it's following the internal compass of each person to find a way to move forward in a new way. So Yeah, but well said, Megan.
Oh, I was just going to say, well said to you. That was lovely.
Oh,
That's exactly right. Everybody's the expert in their own experience.
hmm.
Hey, thank you so much for being here with us for our introductory look at what grief is. There will be a link to an evaluation below this video if you'd like to take a look at that and help give us some valuable feedback. That would be wonderful. And there's also some additional resources that are listed there as well, so that if you feel like you'd like to carry on your education or know more about this or continue to investigate, then absolutely please take advantage of those resources that are down below the video. And just thank you so much for spending your time sharing your heart with us.